Right. Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Rafe Spies, and I'll be your host for today's call. Today's topic is back to school, getting hearts and minds ready to take the next step, and it is presented by the Trauma Action Group, or TAG, in conjunction and partnership with Headside Services. On today's call, we have a panel of experts to talk to us about their experiences of lockdown, but most importantly, talking about what we think might happen next. First off, we have Dr. Pooky Knightsmith, who is I think it's fair to say, prolific keynote speaker, lecturer, trainer, and author, and she has a PhD in child mental health. And if you haven't seen any of her videos on YouTube, I strongly recommend you go and have a look. I've gotten quite addicted to them during lockdown myself. We're also joined by Darren Pearce, who leads a large infant and junior federation school in Gloucester, and is a governor of an alternative provision school and is involved very much in the schools district partnership. Hello, Darren. Thank you for joining us.
Morning.
John Rees is an educational trainer and coach, and since 2005, John has worked with local authorities, schools, charities, and commercial groups across the UK and abroad to provide coaching and training. And of course, Tony France, who is the director of Headside Services and the Trauma Action Group, as well as being a school governor and advisor to local education authorities. So, thank you also everybody out there for joining us today. We've got roughly 100 people or so on the line today, which is fantastic. We asked you a little bit about where you are from. So the answers we received were 59 in total education professionals, 25 parents, 33 children's services professionals, and 17 were sort of in the other category, which will happen sometimes. So to make the most of this call, I hope you enjoy yourselves. You can arrange the windows on your screen to show all of the speakers at once or just the person who's actually speaking at the time. I think if I'm pointing in the correct corner, it'll be up there somewhere. That'll just help you get the most from the experience. At any time during the call, you can ask us questions using the Q&A button. So there's a Q&A button down the bottom of your screen, and you can send questions through. We'll dedicate more time to questions at the end, but if you have a question in the meantime, please go ahead. And I hope you enjoy the call. Just be aware that the call is being recorded as we go through. So I don't think it's exaggeration at all to say that we're in a very strange, unusual time. It's probably a huge social experiment. Nobody really quite knows what's going to happen, how things will proceed. And the potential for long-term impacts for mental health and so forth are certainly there. This just shows roughly some of the questions that we'll be looking at today. So we're going to talk about how ready are we to return to school practically, mentally, and emotionally? What can we do to prepare hearts and minds? And what needs to change, and can we turn this into an opportunity for real lasting change in the way that we take care of children and teachers and parents as well, of course, and find the right balance between physical safety, mental health, and education and development. We asked you before this call for your thoughts, and thank you everybody for filling out the registration questionnaires. Fairly clear trend on this one. Do you think this is the right time for schools to be reopening? And 76% have said no. 24% have said yes, obviously. How prepared are you for your child to return, or yourself to return to school? And this was sort of an even spread. I think Tony said earlier that an optimist could view this one way as a pessimist could view it the other. There's no real clear trends, but I think what you can take from that is a fairly high percentage of people are saying we just don't feel that we're ready to actually go back to school at this point. We also asked you, when school returns, how confident are you that children will have access to a safe adult relationship at times of stress? There's a real spread here. I think, it's almost equally run across the board of all those responses, from absolutely not confident at all to highly confident. And I think one of the themes that you'll see through today's discussion is that there's no one size fits all approach for everything that we do. Every child is different, every family is different, and every school is different. Some of the comments that you provided us just in the general comment section were really interesting and enlightening as well. So we asked, what are your biggest concerns about the return to school? How social distancing will affect their mental health? The impact returning at this stage could have on the mental health of pupils, in particular anxiety, and in particular SEND children. Making children more anxious than they need to be. Prompting a second spike in the epidemic, which is obviously the balance of getting education, development versus safety. The risk of infection, as my daughter has type 1 diabetes. Teacher safety, One of the responses I haven't put in here, a woman said that she has 3 special needs children who are all huggers. So this is the sort of practical issues that we're all going to have to start facing into. Very young children's experience of school or nursery being damaged. So I take that as meaning that it's almost a long-term effect will be that it's changed their overall view of what school and school life is going to be like. Working on a one-to-one basis, toys needing cleaning all the time, difficulties with returning to school, and separation anxiety. And then lastly, just quickly, what do you believe would be most helpful from the transition back to school for children? This one I like particularly letting the children know what to expect. We often sort of think that the discussions go between adults, but they also need to go with children, and giving thought to who is in each group is staggering attendance. Predictable structure and routines, more scientific evidence that is safe to return. Let's discuss. So from there, I thought we might just launch straight into discussion with yourself, Darren. It's funny we talk about this idea of going back to school. You haven't stopped. You've been working all the way through this period. And I'd love to know a little bit more about reflecting in some ways on what you've just seen from the survey results and your own experiences. How's it been? What's the experience been like? How have the kids adapted? How have you adapted? How have the teachers adapted? And what have you learned?
Well, I think it's a very remarkable situation, isn't it? I think we're all being dealt with a set of cards that is difficult to manage. It's challenging times. I think personally, it's just to make whatever happens when schools, if and when they return, is to make sure that the children are safe. That's the key thing that parents want to hear. That's what the key thing all school communities will want to know. And I think for me as a head teacher and other leaders around the county from where I'm from, it's trying to make a clear message or create a consistent message to parents with so many variety of different elements going on that they're hearing from the media, from the government, and reassuring them that the steps we're going to take to support their children with safety, curriculum, social distancing measures has been thoroughly thought through. Risk assessments, staff safety, child safety in and around school, how that looks has got to be really unthreatening to when families arrive at school on that date when school's reopening. And children have to have an element of familiarity. And that's the difficult thing, because they will be coming back to an environment that is alien to them. And I think we've been discussing prior to this, how much the environment they're currently in with homeschooling and with their parents at home is also an alien place for them. So coming back to something that was trying to make it as familiar as possible for them is going to be a challenge. But I think at the forefront, safety and trying to almost train them in a way, in a childlike manner, how to respond to the new guidelines. How we do that for 4 and 5-year-olds will be an ongoing daily challenge, and how we review that is going to be essential moving forward, potentially when the government may say the rest of the world can go back to school, which at the moment is supposed to be at least a month before the summer holidays. I think, that's quite a negative slant on things, but I think the positive element is that your teachers and professionals within their school communities are working incredibly hard behind the scene to make sure that those children, those in all groups, including families, are being supported, communicated to. I'm always on the phone to families. My staff are always on the phone to families, setting of work, sending nice messages to kind of keep the support there and to motivate the children at home, because they're finding it incredibly hard. It's 9 weeks in and becoming anxious that this is the new normal. And I think everyone that's working in the education sector is also probably feeling that it's going to be a very unclear environment and landscape when we return, and if we return. And at the forefront, we've got to consider what that transition looks like for children coming out of a reality at home currently and into a new one when they arrive back at school. And even harder, we're going to have the youngest children to be able to manage that and support them. So it's been very challenging, but I feel very privileged to work with many people, and we've got loads of colleagues listening today, that all they're thinking of is safety for the children, and to give them something to engage upon and harness a curriculum that's going to look very, very different to improve their emotional well-being. So very, very difficult, but fortunate that we have experts that we work with that are all fortunately on the same thread, the same theme, unlike some of the messages we might be receiving and some of the kind of the unclarity around what we're trying to deal with.
Okay. Thank you. So on that theme of just thinking about what we've seen so far or during this time, and in a moment I'll shift the conversation more towards thinking about the next steps, but I wondered if perhaps Tony and Pooky as well, if you wanted to tell me just a little bit about some of what you've seen during this time. I imagine it might reflect on some of the things we spoke about the last call, but what are some trends you've seen? How have people been responding to this time period? Perhaps Pooky, if you'd like to start.
A massive question, and I've got kind of both the professional hat on, but also mum of two 10-year-olds, one of whom is a kind of, well, was a recovering school refuser, and what happens next on that is a big question. But there's been some real positives, and I think it's really important to point that out. I was preparing some answers for parents who'd put questions into the BBC yesterday, and there was lots of concern around the negative impact, particularly on young children, around attachment and separation anxiety and what will happen next for them, and children perhaps who are preparing to go to school for the first time in September. And there's a lot of anxiety and worry there. But I do think that what has happened for those children in particular is that for many of them, not all of them, but for many of them, they will have formed stronger, better bonds with their primary attachment figures at home. And they will have had opportunities that they might never have had in a different time, because we have to all be together and be finding new ways to be together. And we know that, children who form those strong bonds are much more able to transfer those attachments, and that if they've got a really safe base, that they are more able to go out and explore the world. And that's going to be true for our kids, whether they're 2, 3, 4, 15, 16. If they've got that strong relationship at home, they will be better able to kind of cope with what's coming next. So I think for me, that's the thing I have to keep coming back to, is that, yes, it's really challenging. It's challenging for all of us, but we're working really hard to try and make sure that we're creating an environment where those kids can thrive, and all isn't lost. It'll take careful handling for many years, but all is not lost.
Sure. And Tony?
I guess I'd echo an awful lot of that. One hopes that the bonds that have been made at home are able to be transferred into school. I think those going to school for the very first time, I wonder if in some ways it'll be slightly easier, because they don't necessarily have a template for what they're looking for in terms of safety. So it'll be a new and novel experience, but it will be new and novel for them, whatever. I think some of those that I worry about are children going back to school where the environment has changed. For their own emotional safety, what will have happened is they'll look for things that are familiar in the environment, they'll look for things that are predictable in the environment, and maybe some of that, it will have changed. And also, I suppose, Darren talked about safety, and risk assessments and all that, which is huge. But we shouldn't get caught up in the practicalities of safety. Yes, there needs to be catch it, kill it, bin it. There needs to be, the washing of hands, some kind of, new routine of washing hands or whatever else. But the internal safety, the emotional safety of children and staff, because I was thinking about the core conditions for trauma around it being expected, us being prepared, and overwhelming our resources to cope. And just in my brief kind of revisit to the news, what we see is that those are all terms that are being used in the general media. Well, we didn't expect, or we're trying to be prepared. We don't want the NHS to be overwhelmed. So we're actually using the language of trauma, even in the general media, without perhaps making the direct link to the possible for psychological harm where those conditions exist at the same time. I was really, the one mitigating factor for children will be the ability to access a safe relationship at times of stress, which was one of the questions we asked at the beginning of this. And I'm really worried that 50% of people are either unsure or think that their children won't have access to a safe adult at times of stress in school. That's really concerning for me.
Well, we'll come back to that thought in a moment, I think, because it's very important that we don't lose that. But let's, obviously the conversation is going towards when we actually will go back, or kids will go back to school. The government has produced some sort of mammoth paper. It wouldn't be a government without producing papers and organising task force and watchdogs and so forth. John, you seem to be one of the handful of people on earth who've read all the guidelines and have gone through it with a fine-tooth comb and can enlighten us on the finer points. But I'd love it if you could give us a bit of a view of some of what you've seen there, but particularly, is there provision in there, or is there a focus on mental health, or is it purely on practical issues?
Yeah, again, that's a huge question, but a good one, Rafe. I think all teachers or anybody involved with education or parents will know it's a mess, I think is the short answer. I'm not getting particularly political about that, but there was, Boris Johnson announced some strategies on the Sunday. The DfE came out on the Monday. The unions questioned that. So they said, oh no, that was just draft, and they've reproduced. I think teachers have every right and parents have every right to feel concerned because of the lack of clarity. And yet I know personally at least of a dozen or 15 head teachers who are absolutely focused, first of all, on their values and on getting this as good as they possibly can for their staff and for the children. And I think we shouldn't forget that enormous sense of moral compass that almost every teacher I've ever met in sort of 40 years of education still has about getting this right for kids. We've talked a lot about already a bit about the return of early years reception, year 1, year 6. I think we shouldn't forget that year 11 and 13 are also at some stage supposed to be returning. And I think it's important, as you said, we don't get hung up on a specific date and exactly how that's going to happen, but we have to come back to some principles. A lot of people will question the government's focus on taking the right decisions at the right time, priority to keep the country safe. And at the same time, the safety and the well-being of staff is absolutely paramount. But as the 3 other panelists have already said, I think it's absolutely crucial that we retain a sense of safety, but also that we don't try and rush back to a new normal that was the same as the old normal, because it can't be. It can't be because we're different, but also I think, there will be a lot of commentators who said the education system as it was up until the middle of March this year really wasn't working for an awful lot of children and young people. So I think now would be a fantastic time, not just to return to school, but to think a bit about what education is for, what we want it to do, and is our curriculum really adequately preparing children who are likely to live into the 22nd century. So there are some big picture stuff there. But I think, as the other panelists have said, it's about coming back to our values, us making sure as school leaders and governors and whoever else, that we are okay as we possibly can be to make it okay for the kids, and to work in compassionate, trauma-informed ways that are not, first of all, not going to do any harm, but secondly, will do good for everybody, children, staff, parents, adults. I think we have to allow us, nobody's an expert in returning from a pandemic, but I think we have to come back to our core principles about just being supportive, being kind, being gentle, and perhaps monitoring our own emotions so that when we see ourselves or a colleague getting a bit ratty or flying off the handle, whether that's next month, next year, or in a few years' time, I think there are some really powerful ways of using trauma-informed approaches to say, well, instead of just responding in that sort of punitive or aggressive way, just to say, how do we get behind this? What's going on here? And what do we want out of this situation for the best interest of that young person?
It all makes perfect sense. And I think that sounds very, very, very sensible. But do you think that was what the government guidelines have addressed any of this? Or do you think they've just been focused purely on catch it, bin it, kill it, or those kinds of things?
You're right. I think, no, the government guidance has focused simply on the structure of opening the doors and getting people back in again. And there will be cynics who suggest that that's simply about enabling the workforce to return to reboost the economy. I suppose it's really important we recognise that schools haven't ever closed, that they've always been open to the vulnerable and key workers, although that's probably only about 2% at the moment. The unions and the professional associations, I think, to an extent, quite rightly saying, how does this work? And the government has, I think, focused on some of the practicalities, but have ignored the mental health, trauma-informed, social emotional well-being of everybody. I was talking to a trainee teacher recently who was just saying, well, you kind of got to put Maslow first before you can get anywhere near Bloom's. And I think there's something really important about making sure that we have the social emotional stuff, the practical, the social emotional well-being supported by the practical before we can get back to any sort of traditional, if you like, approaches to learning. So it's all about relationships. It's about relationships between children, between staff, how those staff model relationships, relationships with parents, and making sure that we make it as okay for each other as we possibly can.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's focus then, just looking forward a little bit more to the return and what that might look like at some point in the future. We won't name dates because there's a risk that we get that wrong or something. Most children in the UK will be returning to school. It might be very soon. It might be in a period of time. It might be longer for some kids simply because of their age or because of health conditions. There's all kinds of things. But at some point, we will be seeing children return to school and, of course, adults returning to work. Before we kick that sort of next bit of the discussion off, I thought I'd launch a little bit of let's call this a bit of a layman's poll, which is just asking two very simple questions. And this applies for people who are parents or for teachers as well. Just very simply, when children return to school, I expect their overall mental health will improve, be about the same, or get worse. And when children return to school, I expect my own mental health will improve, be about the same, or get worse. So just take a moment now, everybody in the, and panelists, you are welcome to reply to this if you want. It's completely anonymous, so we won't call you out on that one. But just to get a bit of a general feeling, because we had some surprising results in the questionnaires from the previous webinar. Okay. So that's sort of quite interesting. It's interesting to see that the general feeling is that children's mental health will probably suffer to some extent, but it looks as though people feel as though their own will perhaps be better. I'm just wondering if anybody might want to sort of take some of that forward. Tony, I wonder if I could put you on the spot and ask you what your thoughts are about what sort of things we're seeing here and what you might think that people can expect or will experience when they go back to school.
I think when I think about the whole school community, so I think about teachers coming back, TAs coming back, and just not knowing what life is going to be like. I think that the stress on our emotional well-being is going to be huge. I think parents are going to be really worried for all kinds of reasons. It might be about their own health reasons. It might be about whether or not they've still got a job to go back to. So yeah, but do I think that some parents' mental health will improve? Yeah, I think so. Not just because they got rid of the kids, but also I think people are losing a sense of purpose. I don't know how many times people have said to me, I don't know what day it is. What day is it today? Or it's a bank holiday. Really? What's, because the experience of lockdown has really just become grey, that there is, is merged from one to another. We've lost meaning and purpose. And that's going to be really poor for people's mental health, both families, adults and children. So finding meaning and purpose is going to have to be quite a priority for us, really.
Okay. And
I would agree with that, Rafe. If I can interject slightly, I'm just looking at some of the things that have been sent through about how schools are going to manage staff well-being with the additional workload of being in school when homeschooling those children and cohorts that aren't in school. And I think going back to what we mentioned earlier, staff haven't turned off. I mean, they've worked through Easter and they're going to be working through half term, communicating with families. So there's going to be a no off switch at the moment for those working in schools. They're doing a great deal of that behind the scenes and will continue to do so whenever we do go back. Mm-hmm. And I think, one of our audience members has said about how we're going to juggle the kind of homeschooling and the teaching within school to try and make it as balanced as possible so no one misses out, and be able to do that and rotate that. So we're looking after the staff that are coming working in two different environments, and as well as adhering to guidelines, and obviously how we're going to express that to the children is going to be an incredible job. It's unprecedented. It's going to be very, very difficult. But managing that from my point of view is going to be my main job. moving forward, particularly when they release news or an announcement saying other cohorts can come back. I just can't personally see how that would be manageable going forward.
Gosh. And Pooky, do you have any thoughts about perhaps what things would be like when we first start to see kids heading back? But also, is there anything we can do now to prepare? Is there anything that we can kind of do to steel ourselves for that wonderful day in the future when it all just magically goes back to school and everything's back how it was?
Yeah, when that happens overnight. Yeah, I think one of the things that I just want to acknowledge just briefly though is I love lockdown. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Lots of people like me who are autistic or who have struggled for whatever reason with school or the world at large. If we've been able to create a new normal and a sense of routine and safety within lockdown, for some of us, actually this might be the best things have felt for a while. And granted, certainly personally, I have to be careful not to look beyond this very carefully curated bubble that I have made for myself. But I'm scared about when lockdown ends, for myself, for my kids, for other kids who might be vulnerable for whatever reason, because actually how it is right now feels quite good. And I think it is worth acknowledging that, because I think that for some people, they're desperate to get back to normal and they want things to return as quickly as possible and they really miss it. But for some of us, we're kind of thriving on now. In terms of what we can do to sort of help ourselves to prepare, I think one of the things is the really important role that the various different adults play in children's lives right now. And as adults, we need to be thinking about how do we ensure that children feel safe and confident about what comes next? How do we ensure that they do have that trust, that they're able to have open and honest discussions with us and really explore their fears and worries in an age and stage appropriate way, and know that they'll get honest answers from us. I think one of the most challenging things right now is that we don't know the answer and we can't predict the future. So very often when a child comes to us with concerns or we're thinking about what's next for them, we've got a bit of an idea and we've got lots of experience of perhaps similar situations and we know how it might play out. This is new for all of us. And I think we need to remember that and be kind to ourselves. But yeah, be open and honest in our communication with our children and be prepared to kind of try new things and be a bit flexible in that approach.
Tony, would you add any, putting yourself?
Yeah, a couple of things. And I think I mentioned earlier, but when we polled people last week, when we were talking about people's experience of lockdown, over 50% said that their relationships and routines at home had improved as a result of lockdown. And I think that in some ways, people, and certainly my wife has, just loved lockdown. It is, it's a gift from heaven to be able to create or curate, as Pooky put it, this bubble, where actually all the things that you want to be in that bubble are in there, and the routines. So actually coming out of lockdown, it's almost like it's just the idea of coming out becomes the most anxiety provoking idea that we don't get as far as thinking about practically what does that mean. It's just the idea of that veil being lifted that provokes the anxiety. And probably, whereas for me, I'm the opposite. I'm being I'll use the term social butterfly. I'm missing the pub and the bar and lots of people and chat and all the rest. But I recognize that an awful lot of people, my friends and family, actually this has been some of the calmest time for them. And it can be really anxiety provoking to come back into we don't know what that looks like. It was anxiety provoking before. And I think that the most important thing is what Pooky said about, we don't know. We can be called experts in our own fields and all the rest of it, but none of us are experts in this because this is a unique set of circumstances that is being interpreted differently by different people. And will last a generation in terms of the creation of new and unique experiences from our, not shaking hands. How can you be British and not shake hands with people? How can you, just some of those kind of, I suppose, social norms that are going to have to change. The children that are huggers, as you mentioned earlier, Rafe, through to the, how do you greet somebody? Just very, very different. And that's going to be anxiety provoking for all of us, I think.
You might have to become a nation of bows, which could work. John?
It is. Tony's absolutely right. But at the same time, we're all aware that for many children, a small minority of children, school has been the one safe place. And there will be plenty of children who have been locked down with violent, aggressive adults, with abusive adults, and that hasn't been safe for them. And actually returning to school is going to be good for them and is safe for them. Whether that needs to return to a drive towards phonics and SATs and times tables or GCSEs is a separate question. But I think it is about enabling children to have access to emotionally well-regulated adults who can be there for them. They may not be able to hug them in the way that they would perhaps normally do, or support them if a child falls over, whatever. I think there are some really powerful, some new norms to be adjusted to there. But I think there are also a recognition that school is a good place for most kids. Having said that, I'm also conscious, Rafe, of one of the comments about returning to the okay bits of school. So no trips or clubs, a very little sport, perhaps no music. It's going to be incredibly hard for us to be able to manage that. I just think we have to do it in the best possible way we can, with compassion, with support. And what we don't need is parents looking at school A and comparing it with school B, saying, well, they're doing this, why aren't you doing that? I'm governor of a school in a very deprived community in Leeds. They are doing extraordinary work to be able to manage the situation as it is, and they have every confidence they will do that really well going forward. But what they don't need is to be compared to somebody else who is doing things differently simply because of the facilities that they have.
Darren?
Yeah, I was just going to pick up what Tony said in terms of children returning to school and how they feel about that. I have major concerns, particularly with the younger children, about that separation. The ones that don't necessarily know they want to come back to school, but they've been with mum and dad, and not being able to hug a child or to be able to comfort a child re-entering an alien environment is going to be incredibly hard. And our makeup as educationalists isn't to kind of stand afar and just off you go over there. And that's how it's going to be initially. And we're going to only be able to communicate verbally, and that kind of physical contact that children with those anxieties coming into this new environment is going to be key, how we manage that, which will probably in turn have an impact on whether parents of in reception will be sending them back into school. Because for us, we have that's a daily challenge anyway, regardless of the situation. This happens anyway with anxiety with children coming to school. It could be something happening in school they're worried about. So this is something that we do and plan for every day, but this particular guidelines in place and having to adhere to them and train them, I feel like the mental scarring for those children and parents seeing it happen and not us being able to actually physically do anything about it is going to be really hard.
Yeah.
And that's the bit, that's that kind of gut-wrenching feeling of not being able to empathise or sympathise with the family on their 2-metre supermarket distant sprayed lines coming into school. It is going to be very, very different for them, and again creating more anxiety, which obviously looking at the poll, I think initially the children's mental health will probably be quite low. Obviously it'll take some time for them to get used to that, to hopefully improve their mental health and well-being. To see that actually happening will be a tough. I think we'll get that quite a bit.
I think for me, something Pooky said earlier, which is really important, which is about attachment, is that, those children coming back into school who are avoidantly attached will be fine, because actually everybody staying at a reasonable distance will just do them okay, thank you. However, those anxiously attached and those who are more disorganized in their styles of attachment are going to really struggle with interpreting very, very new non-verbal communication and not really having a filter to make sense of that. So I think schools are going to have to become a lot more attachment aware in terms of really understanding attachment behaviours, both of staff and children. Again, the idea that it's not just children that have attachment, that actually, you know, it's existential, it happens between us. A lot of staff and TAs and people are really going to struggle in the face of a really distressed child not knowing what they are or not able to do. There is nothing more painful than to feel overwhelmed or powerless in the face of a distressed child.
I might just take a moment to, and apologies everybody, I hadn't realised that the poll results weren't visible to you, but I shared them just a few moments ago. But I launched another poll, which is just picking up on that question of some of the long-term effects. So just asking people, how likely is it that the pandemic will lead to trauma for some children? Just give us your general views there, and panelists, again, you're obviously welcome to vote yourselves. It seems like some of the conversation we've had that might enlighten that to some extent. I'll just give it a few moments now. It's like watching a horse race. And I've seen on the conversation, the discussion here, which is great. It's great to hear everyone sharing your points, which is wonderful. A few people having technical problems. We hope they can be overcome, but in the true IT fashion, just switch it off and switch it back on, and that fixes 90% of problems, I find. So just a few more seconds for the poll while we're here. Okay, thank you everyone for voting. So it seems like fair few people think that it's likely, lots of people thinking it's very unlikely or not too likely. I guess what I'm looking for here is we are thinking a great deal about being in lockdown. We're all starting to think more and more about moving back to school and what's going to happen next and those practical things. Someday this is all going to be a distant memory, and we're all going to think back all to that time. And I'm interested to ask the panelists, and perhaps some of the questions that we'll answer shortly as well, is what does that future look like? And I'm hoping that you know, trauma will not be a big long-term problem, that people's education development won't suffer. How can we kind of avoid some of those problems? And perhaps, Pooky, if I'm going to throw you in the deep end with a huge question once again, so sorry about that. Do you have any thoughts about, you know, not just thinking through this short-term period, but how we can make sure that the long-term is going to go as well as possible, the adults of the future, as you say?
Yeah, so we're building strong adults from our COVID kids. Yeah, so luckily I prepared a framework on this earlier. So I'll just share with you very briefly what I think that looks like. And if you're kind enough to do so, we can send everyone out links to the kind of fuller version of that after if they want to engage with it. So when beginning to think about the return to school and wider reopening, I was trying to think, well, what do we do to try and mitigate this kind of trauma right now? And initially I was thinking about our most vulnerable children, but the more that I thought about it, the more I realized what we needed was a universal approach, because everybody is going to be impacted in some way by the current situation, and that's not just the kids but all of the adults around them as well. So I wanted to put together a simple framework to help schools and other organizations frame their thinking about how do we try and return to normal. So it's very simple. It's called the SWAN framework, and it's called the SWAN framework because I often talk about how as adults we need to be the swan, the idea being that the swan glides gracefully across the surface of the water and you can't see the frantic paddling beneath. And it's okay that we're frantically paddling, but sometimes what kids need is to see that we are calm and safe and supportive. So we need to be the swan. There might be moments when we talk about the paddling and we explain that to them, but they need to know that they're safe with us, essentially. The SWAN framework has 4 elements. Spell SWAN. So the first is S for safety, and I think that is the first thing we have to think about as we're thinking about the return. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff already around how do we create a physically safe environment, and that's really important, and we've got to get that right first. We also need to think about how we communicate that so that families, for example, feel confident sending their children to school, and that the messages that children get from their parents parents are, it's okay, you will be safe. Because if there's fear at home, that's going to come through for the kids, and that's going to make this all very difficult for everyone. So physical safety, but then also thinking about how do we create an emotionally safe environment? How do we create a cognitively safe environment for kids perhaps who've got behind in their schoolwork and they've forgotten how to do things? You know, this is like a massively extended summer holiday, and no matter how hard, and I know that, you know, Darren, yourself and your team and teams across the country have been working really hard to keep our kids educated, but it's not going to be the same as if they've been in school. So how do we create this kind of cognitively safe environment? So how do we get it safe is the first thing. The W is for warm and welcoming. How do we ensure that when kids, when families, when staff come back across that threshold, this feels like a place where they want to be. This feels like a place that welcomes them, despite the fact that we've got these social distancing measures in place. That's no mean feat, and we're kind of trying to think about what that looks like, particularly for our little ones that we want to kind of hold and cuddle and show nurture to in that way. But how do we make this feel warm and welcoming, and what are some of the new normals there around interaction as well in particular? The A is for all together. That's because this isn't something that we can do on our own. This is not something that families can do on their own. This is something we've got to do all together. And one of the really exciting things about the current situation is I feel, in my experience, that a lot of our professional roles have completely fallen away because we're all beginners again. We are all at the start of working out how on earth do we make this work, and whether we are a clinical psychologist or a doctor of medicine or a teacher or a learning support staff member, we are all basically just looking at this with a very child-centered view of how do we make this okay for our kids. And so we've got to be in it all together, and we've got to really think about how do we collaborate and move forward in a kind of unified way around the child and with the child as well. And then N is for nurture. And here I'm really encouraging schools and other organisations to really focus on how do we create an environment of fun and play and connection and relationship, and really focus on nurture rather than worrying about things like attainment. That will matter and it will come. But I've had some really encouraging early conversations with Ofsted and so on, who do understand that we've got to have different priorities right now. And I think giving ourselves permission to focus on trying to repair this rupture so that our children can thrive and succeed, not maybe this year, but maybe next year, maybe the year after. We're trying to build that environment for those strong adults. So there you go, swan in a nutshell.
I've never heard that expression before. I noticed, Darren, you're frantically writing the SWAN model down, and I assume that means...
Yes, I am.
I've created an online training course on it, which is free for everyone, which I will send a link through to afterwards. And there is, so it's just a series of videos where I explain it a little bit more in depth than that. And then there's a guided discussion template, so that as a school leader, you can this for a discussion with your staff about, well, what does this look like for us? Because it will look different in each different place, and it's really designed to kind of scaffold and springboard your thinking rather than telling you what to do. I don't know the answers, sorry.
No, I mean, Darren, does that, as an educator, does that sound like a sensible approach?
Yeah, I think there's so much out there, isn't it? You can link into, plug into, and certainly signpost parents and families. But to have something a blanketed, universal approach that just doesn't look at the kind of medical element, but everything, the social, the emotional, the cognitive. For me, and particularly, I know it referred to some of the Q&A that's come through with the SEND children who thrive on all of those things, trying to be aligned as possible for them to feel safe and to build relationships to move forward. And again, these people are going to be leading the society in years to come. You just think something needs to be there, complete change of how we think. That baseline of, okay, this is the child, this is the canvas, what are they showing me? To have something like this will certainly support their development. And again, we're going to be beginners in this. And I think, yeah, certainly I'll be looking into that, Pooky, and I've just signed up to your newsletter, so there we are.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Thank you. We'll come to the Q&A in a moment, but I'm just going to run one last poll while we're here. So yes, no answer. Do you believe mental health and well-being should be prioritized over education at this time? And I'll just leave that poll sort of running in the background while we'll start to look to some of the Q&A that people have been sending in. It's really, really helpful. Thank you. And I love the discussion that's going on in the background at the same time. It's brilliant. We might just refer this question to Darren. This anonymous says, I love lockdown too. My children both experience social anxiety and have been bullied at school. They are way happier at home than at school. Do you think of a blended learning approach would be possible, perhaps part-time school, part-time home, or John, either of you?
It's a really good question. I think all parents have the prerogative, don't they, whether they send their children to school or not. They can register for EHE, which is obviously something that depends on where you sit, whether you think children do better at home and learning at home, whether they do in school. Obviously, there's definitely that split in thinking about children need that social interaction, but I think that's improving with EHE. I think when it turns to things like issues and problems in school, being a trigger for children to work at home or certainly to be taught by their parents, is that obviously communication coming to school is important to see if they can be dealt with. Those issues need to be dealt with. I mean, that's obvious, and I would always advocate that as a first thing and a first attempt to make sure the children feel happy about coming to school. Yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think it's a very artificial situation, and obviously what we've seen is that maybe some parents might be thinking in the long run, future, actually I like having my children at home. I can do this work. I'm capable of teaching my children. I know them more than anyone. So, and you wouldn't be able to disagree with that. But equally, there are obviously those concerns of interaction and how children develop emotionally and create other relationships that they're so desperately going to require going forward, and to be successful for themselves, for their own self-esteem. So I clearly have skirted around the question there, as our anonymous audience member, but I'd have to sit on the fence a little. But I would say if there are issues that are resulting in educating children at home, then you need to come and speak to your head teacher or the class teacher in the first instance. But yeah, for me, relationships, stabilizing relationships for the future is key, and that might not necessarily be as much at home as you might get from school. So yeah, I think tough one, but understandable. The future is unclear, artificial situation, and would understand why parents might be feeling that way currently.
Okay, thank you. Question, I guess I agree with Dr. K. I like that. I agree with Dr. K. As a pastoral leader, I'm worried about how I can best support those children who will not be looking forward to going back to school and those who find school a stressful environment. Not really a question per se, but are there any other thoughts that you have about that return and what it means for kids who are perhaps happier in this bubble that we've been in the last few months?
No, I'm really worried about it. So very briefly, my daughter Lyra was struggling to attend, and eventually we couldn't make it work with our current school anymore. We moved her to a new school. She'd settled really beautifully, had been there for a few weeks. Lockdown happened. She's completely disengaged from school. However, it's really great now. She's having one-to-one tutoring online and she loves it and she's thriving and she never wants to leave the house again. And I'm trying to work on the basis of like my assumptions with my professional hat on about how I'm most likely to make this work was that I withdrew her from school before those relationships completely fell apart. She was losing all respect for her teachers and for how that was working because yeah, it wasn't going brilliantly. And I thought what I need is for her to not ruin those relationships and her feelings there, and to still foster a love of learning. So that's what I've been focusing on, and on building her up and making her strong and happy and thriving, in the hope that then she will feel able to return. But I actually am not quite sure whether I will succeed in that. So my house is an experiment. I think things to focus on here are thinking about, well, how do we work with families? And I do think that will be the thing that will make a big difference here. So actually both of my children had switched schools recently before this all happened. the daughter who has now disengaged completely, her school had been quite hands-off. The other daughter had also been having issues, also gone to a new school. Her school have been very much in touch. They've done lots of small group discussion. They've talked to me a lot, and they've really helped me to help her. And they've been a bit more kind of forgiving and a bit more flexible in their approach. And I think that's helped. But it's difficult because you don't have endless time in the day, do you? It's really, really challenging. I think one thing that would make a big difference is if we're able to think about what can parents and carers most helpfully be doing, and how can we who work in and with schools be communicating that to them so they can help to ease this transition. I think there is a lot of concern out there, but yeah, I'm really, I don't know the answers. I'm really sorry. I'm trying to figure them out.
It was a silver bullet, no, or a placebo, or whatever. John, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to perhaps remind ourselves that, curiously, at a time when we've needed it most, as from September 2020, PSHE should be statutory. And that's caused schools some anxiety. It's an area of the curriculum that I focused on. But I think there's a danger that we kind of, so a colleague a few years ago told the story about saying to a year 10 student, what's your PSHE like? She said, it's like Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So what? He said, every week there's a new horror. Now, if it isn't drinking, it's drugs, if it isn't, and we kind of grind our way remorselessly through a list of never-ending things. But in some respects, should mental health and well-being prioritise over education? Mental health and well-being is education. And I think, as a number of panellists have already described, until we get that bit right, we can't do the other stuff. We have, not just because it's statutory, but schools will have been working on how do we make PSHE, RSHE, well, you know, personal development, whatever, PSHCE, whatever you call it. How do we really prioritize that? So there's an opportunity to latch upon there. And I'm going to steal a moment of Tony's thunder, because I know that Tony will say, or has said far more eloquently than I can in the past, that relationships are the thing that can resolve or heal trauma. And I think if we can therefore not just teach about relationships, but be relationships, we can model those with children, with each other in front of the kids, as part of Pooky's swan analogy, then that gives us far greater opportunities to help heal and restore and resolve some of the stuff that some children will be facing. And I think there's something about that sort of the tide rising all boats. It's something about, if we can work in this compassionate, trauma-informed way with all of us all the time, then that's going to be good for kids, not just as if and when they return to school, but in the weeks and months and years following that return.
Tony, it seems like a natural place to hand over to you with the thunder of your own.
Sure. I think for me, there's a couple of things there. Something that's important that John said is, I suppose, you know, trauma is not a disease. It's an injury, and an injury can be healed. And if we know what we're doing, then we can find ways to do that, and we can find ways that people can thrive. And actually, all the great thinkers of almost everybody has overcome adversity in order to be who they are. You know, helping children through hurdles, over hurdles, and through adversity. Although I was thinking about, and also just kind of reflecting on what Pooky was saying, wouldn't it be great if there was an opportunity for blended learning? That actually some children do learn better online. I've seen some fabulous online schools that really allow children to thrive whilst they build the cognitive safety and confidence in their life, that perhaps then the social interaction comes. That will be great. However, I am then left worrying about those really vulnerable children who I spend most of my professional life working with, who are being kept at home for the wrong reasons and are not being, you know, and not having their education facilitated. I really worry that somebody asked the question earlier about the increase, are we ready for the increase in social care referrals? If you're working in a school right now, and I'm sure Darren would back me up, it's already happening. We've already got more social care referrals going in because we don't have eyes on these children who are really vulnerable as often as we did before. So we are already more. And then with social care working within the same, difficulties that education and health and the rest of us are, they're unable to do the kind of home visits, they're unable to take the actions to keep children safe that we would hope that they would. And that's, you know, that's not a criticism of anybody. It's just part of this unique experience that we're all having to work our way through. But blended learning, absolutely, I'm up for that. I think it'd be awesome.
Sounds good. Okay, I'm just working through the questions we've been asked. I'm not sure who this question might be best put to. I'm particularly concerned about those children with special needs and a specific sensory need that are all about physical contact. Avoiding touch in this case, wouldn't that be neglecting their needs? I have no idea how you would answer that or who should answer that.
I can probably add a little something we've discussed as a team at my school for those children, particularly SEND, who thrive on relationships, thrive on familiarity, those that need that physical comfort, and those that actually need to be dealt with on a day-to-day basis for other kind of medical needs that they have or any kind of intimate care needs that they might have. And I think I'm definitely going to use what the government has said, that obviously some of these children are going to require support, and those familiar staff that work with them will need to be able to do things with those children during the day. They're going to have to be able to, whether it's changing them or dressing them or helping them with particular medication that they require. And if they've been sent in, having that communication with those families is essential before schools, and if and when they do open, because there's no way schools are going to be able to manage that and manage those children unless there's going to be some element of breaking that bubble. That has to happen, because if it doesn't, I mean, like we mentioned before, through all of this, the thread is that mental health, the anxiety surrounding that, and that obviously will ripple onto the parents. So that reassurance that, yes, it's unlikely the youngest children are going to be able to adhere to social distancing. So I'm using that as a way, well, we're going to have to comfort these children. We're going to have to be able to provide something for them for whatever intimate care needs that they require. And equally, those that don't and those that have one-to-one support generally will need to have that familiarity, will need to have that close proximity, as close as we possibly can, to support them in this very changing environment.
Very strange. It sounds like there's still quite a few small details like that to work through. I think we've got time for one more question, which is from Lisa Andrews. I want my PSHE scheme of work to be focused on everything discussed here today. Which topics would you recommend we discuss in classrooms when returning?
Can I put my hat in the ring for, in addition to the things we talked about today, kind of relationships, healthy coping, relaxation, those sorts of things are important. But I also think very, very key right now is talking about bereavement, and talking about it really openly, really honestly, exploring what grief looks like, particularly in this unusual time. Everyone will know someone who has experienced a bereavement, either directly or indirectly as a result of COVID, by the time that we're through with this, and that's really challenging. But it's also a really positive moment where we can learn to grieve together better, because we're not very good at it, but we can learn together. And young children in particular are often really brilliant in their approach to grief, and we can learn a lot from them. So by having open, honest discussions with them, exploring it, making this a less taboo topic, I think we will really help them out. And yeah, hopefully we don't lose that once this has kind of all got a bit better.
Can I just expand, for me, just go from what Pooky was saying, absolutely brilliant, but also the kind of the broader loss that there's been, there will have been an enormous amount of loss, not just death, not just through the kind of COVID deaths, but actually the opportunity to rehearse coping with loss and bereavement it's a critical opportunity for children. And Pooky's right, we're rubbish. I just jump on a motorbike or drink. Whereas
not both at the same time, I hope.
no, I try not to do both at the same time. So whereas actually as a nation we're very poor at recognizing the loss process, and I guess just finding the one word, and perhaps this is for another webinar one day, but the one thing it's been in the back of my mind that I've been wanting to say is shame. And the impact of shame and the opportunity for it to become really toxic. And there's going to be a lot of children coming back you know, we see the community shaming of people breaking social distancing laws and the media shaming, but also the shame of, actually, I didn't get to do any work while I was off. I didn't get, or I haven't. I'm just really interested that we're going to have to be really sensitive around shame when people come back, because I think that it's something that can get away from us really quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I feel like we've opened a really interesting can of worms just at the last minute. Then we have to close it again because we are completely out of time now. I just wanted to say thank you so much to everybody in the audience who's listening in for all your great questions. We'll do our very best to get the ones answered that we didn't quite get time to get to. We'll get them either answered over email or something like that in the not too distant future. I do want to say thank you so much to Dr. Pooky Knightsmith, John Rees, Darren Priest, and of course Tony France, and Buddy the dog, who I saw made a little bit of an appearance in the background there. Never worked with children and animals, as they say, or banjo players. I think that's the other one. We will send out a summary of this email again at the end here. Please do join up with our mailing list if you haven't already, and we'll also make sure the recording of the call is available on YouTube. So on that note, we'll close up, and thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.